Mayor disguises himself as a beggar and walks through the city. What he witnesses brings him to tears. There was one thing Julian Sterling had never done in 38 years of life: spend an entire morning without anyone knowing who he was. On that cold Tuesday, sitting on the stone sidewalk next to a grey building downtown, he discovered what it meant to be invisible. But I'm going to tell this story from the beginning, because the beginning is where everything makes sense. Julian had been elected mayor 2 years earlier, with a margin the whole city talked about for weeks. He was young for the position, had an honest face, spoke with ease, and promised with an open heart that he would truly look after those who needed it most. People believed him. A lot of people believed. The problem is that believing in a promise and watching it come true are two very different things. 3 weeks before everything I'm about to tell you, a councilwoman from the opposing side had stood up during a session and said out loud what many were whispering in the hallways: "Our mayor doesn't know what happens 2 blocks from his office. He lives in a bubble." And that stung. Not because it was a lie. It stung because Julian, deep down, wasn't sure it was a lie. It was Margaret Vance who gave the final push. Margaret was 65, with short white hair and a way of looking at people that cut through any unnecessary conversation. She had worked with Julian since day one, was the chief of staff he could never impress with excuses, and one of the few people in the world he truly listened to. That morning she walked into his office, closed the door and set a bag on the table. "What's that?" he asked. "An old jacket my brother used to wear, some torn pants, a beanie, a glove without fingers." She paused. "You're going to go out there and see with your own eyes what's happening in this city." Julian opened his mouth to say something about his schedule, about security, about what his advisors would think. Margaret was already at the door. "Either you go, or at the next session Brenda will keep being right." He went. That Tuesday morning, Julian woke up early and got dressed in his bathroom at home, away from any cameras. The jacket was a dark moss green, thick but worn, with the right sleeve unraveling at the seam. The jeans had 2 tears at the knee and 1 at the thigh. The gloves, cut off at the fingertips, let the cold seep in just the same. He pulled the dark blue wool beanie down until it almost covered his eyebrows. He looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. You know, when I picture Julian in that bathroom, wearing a beanie and an old jacket, I can't help but think something heavy must have hit him in the chest. There's something very hard about erasing who you are, even if it's just for one morning. He left by car with a trusted driver who dropped him off 7 blocks from downtown. From there, he went on foot. The city was waking up slowly on that cold morning. The smell of coffee drifting out of a bakery on the corner mixed with the smell of wet sidewalk, the tall buildings and the white sky above them. Julian walked slowly, with his shoulders hunched, not on purpose, but because the cold called for it, and because the jacket was too big for his body, and because somehow his body was already learning to take up less space. The first thing he noticed was that no one looked at him. It wasn't that people looked away with ill intent. It was different. It was as if he weren't there. A man in a suit walked past him talking on the phone, so close that Julian felt the breeze of his passing and didn't even slow down. A young woman with a big backpack nearly tripped over him and said, "Excuse me," to the air, without stopping. Julian stood still in the middle of the sidewalk for about 30 seconds, just to see. No one asked if he was okay. No one moved aside, especially for him. He simply didn't exist in anyone's equation. 2 years of being recognized in every corner of the city, and 5 minutes with an old jacket were enough to disappear. He kept walking. Liberty Square was settling into its early morning rhythm. There was a long stone bench beside a large tree, and sitting on that bench were 3 people. An older man sleeping with his head tilted to the side, a young woman clutching a backpack, and a man in his 50s, unshaven, with very alert eyes, watching the square's movement with an eerie calm, as if he had seen that scene so many times it no longer surprised him. Julian approached and sat at the end of the bench, leaving space. The 50-year-old man turned his head and gave a nod. That was all. "It's cold," Julian said, because he didn't know where to begin. "Every day this week," the man replied. Calm voice, no urgency. "But it gets worse at night." His name was Silas. Julian only learned that later, when Silas extended his hand in a simple, natural way, like someone who had never lost the habit of introducing himself properly. They sat in silence for a while, watching the square. A pigeon landed near Silas's feet and just stood there, as if it knew him. Silas pulled a piece of stale bread from his pocket and tossed a few crumbs on the ground. The pigeon pecked at them. "How long have you been here?" Julian asked carefully. Silas thought for a second. "At this specific square, about 8 months. In the situation I'm in," he paused, "a little over 2 years." Julian let the silence sit there, because he felt it was the kind of answer that didn't call for an immediate comment. Later that morning, while Julian was still on the bench, something happened that he didn't expect. An elderly woman appeared from the street below, carrying a cloth bag in both hands. She must have been around 70, white hair braided down her back, hands slightly trembling but steady on the bag's handle. She walked straight to the bench, without hesitating, like someone who knew the way by heart. "Good morning, Silas," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Dorothy." Silas stood up, and there was genuine courtesy in that gesture. She opened the bag. Inside were a few plastic containers with food: rice, beans, a piece of stewed meat, a couple of slices of cake wrapped in a cloth. She distributed them calmly, for Silas, for the young woman who woke at the noise, for the older man who was still sleeping. She set the container beside him carefully, straightened the lid. Then she looked at Julian. "And you, young man? Have you eaten today?" Julian swallowed hard. "No, ma'am." She pulled another container from the bag. There was always one extra. He figured that couldn't be a coincidence. He later learned that Mrs. Dorothy had been doing that every Tuesday and Thursday since her husband passed, 4 years before. It was her way of not staying still inside the house with an absence too heavy to bear. She cooked in the early hours, alone, and brought it over. There are things you hear and feel like you know that pain from somewhere. A 70-year-old woman at dawn cooking for strangers, not because someone asked her to, not because there was a camera, just because she thought it was what needed to be done. Julian ate Mrs. Dorothy's rice sitting on that stone bench, and it was the first time in a long while that he ate something without being in a hurry to get to another meeting. Silas ate beside him, and while they ate, he shared a little. Not the whole story, because no one tells the whole story in the first conversation. But he told Julian he had worked many years at Skyline Construction Group, that he had cared for his mother through a long illness, that when she passed he was left with her debts and a house that wasn't rightfully his, and that things slowly fell apart, the way things fall apart when there's no one left watching out alongside you. "I tried the City Hope Shelter once," he said at one point. Julian stopped eating. "And? Went on a Monday. They said there was no room. Came back Wednesday, they said the same thing. On Friday, the place was padlocked." Silas shrugged with that calm Julian was beginning to recognize as something learned the hard way. "I gave up, learned other ways to survive the winter." The City Hope Shelter was one of the programs Julian's administration had proudly announced 18 months earlier. There were opening photos, press coverage, speeches. Julian himself had cut the ribbon. He sat there with the container of food in his hand, unable to bring it to his mouth. "Padlocked," he repeated almost to himself. "That's what the others said too," Silas said without accusation, just stating a fact. "But look, no point waiting around for something that's not coming. We learn that early." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Julian stayed at Liberty Square until mid-afternoon. In that time, he saw a lot. He saw a man in a tie walk past the bench where the older man was sleeping and give the sole of his shoe a light kick, complaining under his breath that it was outrageous, that the square was public property. As if the presence of that body were a personal offense. He saw a group of teenagers stop to take pictures of the people on the bench, laughing among themselves, and leave without looking back. But he also saw a girl about 12 years old who tugged her mother's arm in front of the bench and asked for a few quarters to give. Her mother said she didn't have any. The girl opened her own backpack, took out a wrapped cookie, and left it on the edge of the bench with a seriousness in her eyes that didn't match her age. And he saw Mrs. Dorothy, who came back at the end of the afternoon to collect the empty containers. When she walked away, Silas said to Julian, unprompted, "She doesn't know we know her name. She never introduced herself. It was Mike at the corner grocery who told me, after months." Julian didn't say anything, but he felt something rearrange itself inside his chest. What happened early in the evening was what turned everything upside down. Julian was about to call for his car to leave when Silas, without any warning, said something out of nowhere. "You ever heard of a man named Thomas Sterling?" The name landed in the air with a weight Julian didn't expect. Thomas Sterling was Julian's father. He had passed away 8 years earlier, a man who had worked his whole life as a civil engineer, discreet, honest, the kind who didn't show up much but left everything running wherever he went. "Why do you ask?" Julian said, steadying his voice. "I worked with him," Silas replied, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "About 20 years ago. He was in charge of the projects at Skyline Construction Group outside the city. I was the site foreman. I spent 4 years working with that man." He paused and his eyes drifted somewhere more distant. "It was the best time of my professional life, I can say that. He was one of those who treated everyone the same. Didn't matter if you were the engineer or the laborer. You were a person." Julian's eyes were fixed on the stone floor of the square. "Why are you asking about Thomas?" he managed to say. "Because the other day I was here in the square and saw a picture in an old newspaper someone left on the bench. A story about the city's new mayor. And the last name—" Silas paused. "Sterling. So I started wondering if it's family. There are times when life pushes two things that shouldn't touch into the same scene, and you stand there looking at it, not really knowing what to do with what you're seeing." Julian was sitting on a park bench, disguised as a beggar, listening to a man who had known his father describe how he had lost everything and had been sleeping outdoors for 2 years. And this man didn't know he was talking to the son of the person he held in such high regard in his memory. Julian stayed there for another hour. In that time he asked everything he could without revealing who he was, what leaving the company had been like, how he had ended up in that situation, what he had tried over time. Silas told the story with the same calm as always, without excessive bitterness, without drama. He was a man who had made peace with the harshness of life in a way Julian was still trying to understand. When Julian finally got up to leave, Silas nodded his head. "You're not from around here, are you?" Julian hesitated. "Why do you ask?" "Because you listen differently. Most people who sit here want to talk about something of their own. You just listened the whole time." A pause. "That's rare." Julian crossed the square alone, and it was only when he turned the corner and was out of sight that he leaned against the stone wall of the building, hunched his shoulders, and stood there like that for a stretch he himself couldn't measure. His eyes stung. He let them. Back at the mayor's office, Julian was different. Margaret noticed it the moment he walked in. She didn't say anything right away, just closed the door behind him and waited. He took off his cap and set it on the table. He stood there with his hands resting on the wood. "The City Hope Shelter is closed," he said. "In practice, it doesn't work. The people who should be using it can't get in." Margaret stayed quiet. "I want to know why. I want to know who's in charge of it, who approved the report saying everything was working, who signed off." He looked at her. "But before that, I need you to find a man named Silas. He's at Liberty Square. I need to know what can be done for him." Margaret took notes without asking questions. "There's one more thing," he said more slowly. "He worked with my father." Margaret stopped writing. "For 4 years," Julian continued, "and I never knew he existed." In the following days, Julian ordered an inspection of the shelter. What they found wasn't comfortable to read. The place had gone through 3 changes of leadership in 18 months, without the central administration being properly informed of any of them. The funding arrived, but where it went was murky. The service records were full of inconsistencies. The official signing off on the positive reports was someone Julian barely knew by name. In team meetings, no one had raised a single concern. No one had said there was a problem. And Julian, with the schedule he had never asked as deeply as he should have. That weighed on him in a particular way. Because it was easy to blame the official who had signed off wrongly. It was harder to look at himself and admit that the structure that allowed all of it to exist was, in part, a product of how he had managed things. Sometimes you think you know what you're doing well, and then reality knocks on the door and shows you didn't know even half of it. Margaret found Silas on a Thursday afternoon in the square on the same bench. She went alone, without identification, just herself with a canvas bag. She sat down next to him and talked for nearly an hour. She didn't offer anything right away, because she knew that offering before listening was the wrong way to start. When she got back to the mayor's office and reported to Julian, she said something he never forgot. He asked what my name was, and genuinely cared. And when I told him my last name, he thought for a while and then asked if I had any connection to a Julian Sterling who had become mayor. Margaret paused. I said I worked with him, and Silas said, I hope he's as good a man as his father. That's all. Then he changed the subject. Julian stood listening with his back to her, looking out the mayor's office window at the city below. Can you help him? He asked without turning around. I've already started, she said. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot since we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The process wasn't simple, and Julian made sure it wasn't. He didn't want Silas to get special treatment because of his connection to his father. He wanted him to receive the same treatment that anyone in that situation should receive, and that he hadn't been receiving up until then because the system had failed. Margaret arranged access to the shelter, which had been reopened under new management after the inspection. There was a vacancy available, and Silas accepted it with that quiet dignity he carried into everything he did. The official responsible for the reports went through an internal process. Other similar problems came to light during the investigation. Julian publicly announced an overhaul in the way the city's programs were monitored, with enough transparency for residents to understand that something had truly changed, without exposing anyone individually who didn't need to be exposed. Councilwoman Brenda, who had said he lived in a bubble, learned through people close to him that the mayor had gone out in disguise through the streets. She could have used that to attack, to say it was a marketing stunt. Instead, at a regular council session 3 weeks later, she stood up and said that, whatever the motive, the result had been concrete, and that she would rather acknowledge a success than pretend it didn't exist. There was a silence in the chamber that lasted about 5 seconds, the kind of silence that only happens when something genuine appears in a place where the genuine is rare. Julian went back to Liberty Square once, without a disguise. It was an afternoon of weak sun, the kind where the light seems good, but the cold is still there. Silas was on the same bench, but there was something different about him. A neat bag at his side, a clean coat. His eyes were still alert, but with less of that weight of constant uncertainty. Julian approached and stopped before getting close, waiting to be recognized. It took about 2 seconds. Silas stood up slowly. "So it was you," he said. There was no anger. There was no awkwardness. There was something close to a calm acceptance, the kind that comes from someone who has seen a lot and learned to separate what's worth carrying from what isn't. "It was me," Julian said. Silas nodded. He spent a moment looking at his face, like someone comparing it to something stored in his memory. "Your father would have approved of what you did." They were few words, but Julian thought that, coming from that man on that bench, they were worth more than anything he had received since taking office. They stayed there in the square for a while without hurry. Mrs. Dorothy showed up soon after with her cloth bag, as she did every Thursday. When she saw Julian in his suit next to Silas, she looked at the two of them with a raised eyebrow. "You two know each other." "We do," Silas said, with a smile Julian hadn't seen on him before. Mrs. Dorothy shook her head with the air of someone who is no longer surprised by anything in this life. "Well then, you should know that this square needs a new bench over in that corner. That one's falling apart," she pointed without ceremony. "And the lighting at night is a hazard. A real hazard." Julian took his phone out of his pocket. "Can you give me more details?" She did, with precision, with patience, with that wisdom of someone who knows every stone of that square better than any report could describe. And so began what the city would call, months later, the greatest community listening program the municipality had ever attempted. Born not from an expensive consulting firm or a mayor's office idea, but from an afternoon at a public square, a stone bench, a bag of food prepared before dawn by a 70-year-old woman who simply thought it was what needed to be done. Julian never forgot that morning. Not the cold sidewalk, not the worn-out jacket, not the chill creeping in through his fingertips. But above all, he never forgot that moment when he sat there without a name, without a title, with no one who knew who he was, listening to a man who had known his father say that life was hard, but that there was no point in waiting for what wasn't coming. There was a lesson in that no meeting had ever given him. And Julian, who had entered the square wanting to understand the city, left there understanding something harder to measure, but far more important, that sometimes the place where we most need to be isn't where we think we belong, and that it's precisely when we disappear that we begin to see clearly. The end of the story. This story stayed with me for a long time after I finished reading it, because it's not about a mayor becoming a hero. It's about a man who needed to disappear in order to see, and it's about Mrs. Dorothy, who never needed any title to know what the right thing to do was, and who did it before dawn, alone, without anyone asking. What did you think of what Julian discovered? Do you think he would have gotten there without having lived through it himself? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one carefully, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time, because there are many more stories like this one waiting for you. Thank you so much for your company.